If anyone out there in Twitter sphere or Facebook Live or YouTube Live or wherever you are is already here, then welcome, herzlich willkommen, bienvenue to Marie's Bundesliga Minutes. This is my first episode as kind of showrunner, so there'll be technical glitches guaranteed. But to more than make up for that, we have Derek Way with us. And Derek, I've been an admirer of your work for a long time. You really make an effort pronouncing players' names correctly. I've seen like photos of the notes you take about players before a game, which is about like font size like 3 or 4, probably.
Scary, yeah.
Yeah, in your version of Times New Roman. And yeah, love the Scottish accent. We have to talk about that, like how you growing up on the northern tip of the British Isles ended up following the Bundesliga.
Yeah.
But warm welcome. And yeah, Derek is joining us from Boston. I'm here in New York. So I guess go East Coast as well.
Yeah. No, thanks for having me, Marie. It's a real honor. And likewise, I enjoy your Twitter feed and what you talk about, and not just the German football, but the other sports and the other interests. And yeah, this should be a lot of fun because as commentators, obviously, we are sort of in the weeds when it comes to the minutiae of games. But the process, I think, is quite interesting to people who are outside, you know, who watch these games. And some assume that commentary is easy, that we just sort of turn up, we roll up and we start talking. And I wish it were that easy, to be honest. It would make my life a lot easier.
Yeah, actually, I mean, just come to think of it, I'm seeing you with those very professional headphones while I am like an amateur just speaking into my laptop. And I've been taught in journalism school what that does with the airwaves, so don't do that. But tell us like how commentating in the pandemic works. You live 6 hours away from from La Liga and from Bundesliga. And we know that you commentated on Barcelona today. Actually, Grant Wall, who I also really admire, shared that wonderful clip of you commentating Ansu Fati's goal, the first in almost a year that he scored, I believe. Take us behind the scenes. I mean, were you sitting where you are now? Were you wearing the same gear? How did that work?
Great question. Everything has changed in the last 18 months. And, you know, I was regularly in Germany. I was in the UK a lot just prior to the onset of the pandemic. And it's funny, I remember February 2020 reading the news, especially the German news, because I read the German news every day. And what was happening in Munich was beginning to worry me. I was in Munich in February for a couple of games, a couple of Bayern games. And that's when the first COVID cases were recorded. Little did I think at that point that a month later, there'd be no travel at all. And now 18 months, going on 20 months later, I haven't traveled. You know, I'm somebody who used to travel every week somewhere for a game. And so we've had to be resourceful. I think that's the side of the pandemic that I hope history will record as having been beneficial. It's a funny thing to say because we don't want to be in a pandemic, of course, but I think it has forced us out of our comfort zones a little bit. And everybody I've worked for, every client I have, because I'm a freelance broadcaster, I don't just work for one company by choice. I work for several, and I like that arrangement. But every client I've had has come up with one idea or another to make it work during the pandemic. And so for me, most of the time it is here. It's not actually in this room. It's in the room just behind the wall there. I have this tiny little, what's essentially a cupboard. And with advice from, you mentioned sound people and good quality sound, with advice from sound experts, we came up with the right acoustics for this room. And so that's where I broadcast a lot of my Bundesliga. It's where I did the EA Sports FIFA games last year and this year. And so I suppose it will always have a special place in my heart.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of picturing you as like Harry Potter underneath the stairs in a broom cupboard. Is it like too dark to read those notes? Do you have kind of like in Germany, there's this whole cultural myth. I don't even know if it's actually true. Maybe it was true like 20 years ago about egg cartons on the walls as like good absorption of noise. Or I mean, in America, I always hear in New York where it's so loud all the time. I'm sure at some point today, you guys will hear ambulances or whatever, probably my dog barking. But in America, there's like this cult of just, like sitting in your cupboard with all your dresses around you to soak up the sound. What is your setup there?
No, you've hit on the right things there, Marie. When you see that cupboard, and I wish I could show it to you, but as I say, it's behind the wall. It is full of clothes, and that was the advice that was given to me, because I did have all these egg cartons ready and all these other devices to try to deaden the sound of the room. But I was also told, if you have clothes in there, that will help, and that's actually where I store the clothes. So I now just add to the clothes, and if I'm doing a session, I'll add even more. And it does work. It's remarkable. And one of the sound people in Germany actually said, he said, you don't need to do anything. Your room is absolutely perfect. Just don't change it. Just make that your room for eternity. And I think even better than some studio setups in different countries, different places. So I've been quite lucky that way. And yeah, I mean, we're all longing to go back to doing what we used to do. But I think if we're realistic, we have to accept that it's not going to be going back exactly to what it was in the short term anyway, maybe someday. But I think being adaptable, to be honest, is part of being a journalist, because that's what you're doing constantly. You're adapting to circumstances. Nothing is ever perfect. And so it's up to you to make the best of the situation you're in.
Yeah. And I mean, adaptable is such a good word there, because while right now it might seem like nirvana to us, before it can't always be like. I lived in Munich the last 2 years, and I know Bayern Munich's fans, they don't have that like rambunctious like reputation like Dortmund or Schalke or like the Revier clubs, or any number, I guess, but they have a big fan culture, and it's a beautiful stadium built so well for acoustics, and you feel very close to the pitch, and everyone's like really like you can see everyone's beneath you, like their hairlines. So when you're commentating there, I don't know if you have commentated Allianz Arena. Tell us about the distractions and the adaptability there. Like, do you ever have people behind you being like, all right, like, can I take a selfie with you, like during the game, or people like cursing in the background, or I don't know, like what happens if there's a terrible situation, like there's a bad injury, and no one really knows. I mean, we've seen that unfortunately too often recently. We saw that with Eriksen at the Euros. So maybe, I know I just threw a bunch of stuff at you.
No. Well, on Eriksen, first of all, I was actually commentating on that incident. I was the commentator for ESPN that day, and it'll stay with me forever, that one, because honestly, you could be in the business 30 years. I've been in the business since the mid-'80s, and nothing can really prepare you for that. You've got to just use all your professionalism and empathy, and not get ahead of yourself as a journalist and say things that are not true. You've got to stick with the facts as you know them. They might be very limited, and just find the right tone as a broadcaster. So, yeah, the Eriksen thing, the Eriksen incident, just thank goodness he's okay. That was the thing that I think we were all feeling at that particular time. On the Allianz Arena, as I said, in February 2020, I was there for 2 games. I've done countless games at the Allianz Arena, and I never tire of going there. I have a sort of a ritual when I go there. I'm a big fan of public transport, so I always get there early. I jump on the S-Bahn and basically make my way in there with the fans, and I take a few photographs. So the same photographs that I've taken every time I've made that walk. And if anybody's watching and has been to the Allianz Arena, and yourself, that walk is actually longer than you might think from the Fröttmanning U-Bahn, S-Bahn. And the viewing positions inside that stadium are remarkably good. I think they're as good as you'll find anywhere. I don't think there's a bad seat inside that venue. And it might not have, as you said, the kind of the Dortmund, Schalke sort of, madness almost in the air, because you feel that when you go to Dortmund or if you go to Gelsenkirchen. But at the Allianz Arena, it's a different crowd, because I think they do genuinely come from all over Germany, from all over the world in normal times. But it's not so much a local crowd. And for some of the fans, for a big chunk of the fans, it's the one time in any given season they might be there for a game, and you sort of feel that. But I love it. I love going there. As I say, I'll never tire of it, and I really miss it. So hopefully one of these days soon again.
Great. And we do have many listeners and viewers regularly that take a particular interest in Bayern Munich. And it may not be necessarily fandom, but, you know, dislike can also be a very strong emotion. So I was wondering, I mean, in Germany at least, it's a bit like in Spain, the Meshki und Club with Barcelona. People might not know this so much globally, but there's this Mir San Mir, which is like a Bavarian pronunciation of "we're us," essentially.
Wir sind wir.
Wir sind wir, exactly. And that is Bayern's motto. And like all great mottos, it's not like a marketing department slapped it on and was like, this is our motto. It just emerged because that's actually what they think. And so as a journalist, do you think that's more like a legend to like sign players? Or, I mean, I'm just thinking of like Uli Hoeneß, and I did some reporting outside his house once. That was so bizarre. But he has this beautiful mansion, like very, very beautiful on top of a hill overlooking the Starnberger See and Alpine Lake. And I read recently that he invited Leroy Sané there when he was having a bad spurt in form, and his wife, who receives faxes for Uli Hoeneß because he doesn't do any emails. So apparently journalists have to send him a fax to the house and then hope that the wife responds. You know, he took an interest in this young player and was like, come over for a barbecue. I know he's done something similar with Kingsley Coman before. And so I was wondering, like, as a journalist, I guess I asked the question at the beginning, is this a marketing slang or a myth, or is that something that makes Bayern Munich special?
I think Bayern as a club are special. I've always felt that. Even going back to my early days watching German football, we're talking here the late 1970s, really. And, you know, in those days, they would win the league. They were starting to become the dominant team. You know, Gladbach, of course, had a big say back then. Hamburg, I sort of think of as the team of the early 80s. In many respects, better than Bayern for 2 or 3 seasons. But really, since then, it has been about Bayern. And, you know, when you win 30 Bundesliga titles, that speaks for itself. I think that they've been probably at the forefront of marketing in Germany. They had a guy called Markus Herwig, who was the longtime press officer. And he was sort of an old-fashioned press officer in the way he did things. But they were one of the first clubs that I knew of anywhere that actually did have this position, they had somebody in place to essentially do the press operations and the press communications. So I think they've always been quite skillful in that area. And the Mir San Mir thing has come later, but I think it actually is a nice addition to what and who Bayern already are. Then you've also got, you know, Packmas is the other thing you'll see online all the time. You know, Wir packen das. You know, more kind of Bavarian language out there, which can be accessible to people who don't speak German or maybe are not immersed in the Bavarian culture.
We got this or something. Or We're gonna like put a hammer to this. It's like
And I think it's nice. I mean, I'm a huge fan of that. I'm a huge fan of clubs who are, you know, let's face it, world brands. I don't really like talking about football clubs as brands, but let's face it, for a lot of people they are. But I like it when these huge clubs like Barcelona with Meshki und Club, I like it when they do send that message around the world that, yes, they are world clubs now, but they're in touch with their roots and they know who they are.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. And I think you do feel that, maybe not so much on their Facebook page, because it's a challenge to replicate that local sense. And like, I lived in Taiwan for a bit. Like, how do you tell someone in Taiwan what Sebener Straße smells and sounds like? By the way, it's kind of a very suburban, you know, mowed lawn, modern, but very understated place. It's not flashy like these incredible grounds in the Premier League.
No, it's not at all what anybody expects. I mean, it's, you know, if anybody, you can get there on the S-Bahn. You could walk it from the center of Munich. I mean, it would take a while, but you can walk it. And as you say, it's just like going through any other street, and there are a few football pitches and a bar and an office, you know, set up, and you wouldn't necessarily suspect that you are on the premises of one of the biggest football clubs in the world. But I again find that part of the charm of it, and I would hope that Bayern would never move away from the Sebener Straße.
Yeah, I agree. It does something, and I know that players relate to that, like people like Franck Ribéry, who had many an opportunity to leave, but felt that kind of hospitality. And he's a complicated character, you know. I'm
Yeah.
not even going to get into that, but he is seen very, very negatively in France. I know that from personal experience, and he just kind of like found a happy place. But anyway, I wanted to get away from that. that was super interesting. So I like kind of dug a little deeper. But it's actually connected. So we've seen many a time that players, beautiful players in terms of their style, like one in a generation talents like Mkhitaryan and Kagawa, and most recently, although I'm always like patience, Jadon Sancho, have had even Nuri Sahin. I mean, I'm trying to think of some player who's not Dortmund, but you know, there are these players who just do so well in the Bundesliga, and then they go abroad. Timo Werner, maybe.
You know? Maybe, yeah.
And although he's a little complicated, I guess, because I do think he's performing well. He's just very unlucky, and maybe some psychological thing going on. It's hard scoring goals, but you know, it is. Maybe I'm biased because I've lived in both England and Germany, but to me, that openness that we talked about, like having a grounds in the middle of the community, fans being allowed to stick their heads through the fence and watch training and be like, all right, mate, bad shot on the weekend, and like take selfies and have a bit of banter. That is just unique. And I didn't find out that that's special until I moved to England when I was about 10 years old. And the people playing for Arsenal, at that time it was Thierry Henry, that may as well have been like Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston for like how close I got to them. And I know that's a shame for spectators, but do you ever think culturally that might also make it harder for players?
Yeah, I think it is a transition for players when they go to England, because the culture is different in comparison with Germany. And I think they are under lock and key much more. I can only give you my experience as a commentator. And when I worked in England, and I was back in the UK for almost a decade, beginning in 2009, and I found it a very different environment from the one that I'd left behind in the early 90s when I moved to the USA for the first time. It used to be much more open. You would have access to managers, certainly, and journalists would know players much more. You know, you would have access to a player because, you know, you would see him in the local pub, or you would see him walking the dog. Or if you were on a flight with a team playing in a European game, you get talking and relationships are forged that way. Nowadays, it just doesn't happen, you know. So, yeah, there are some journalists who, of course, have good relationships with players, probably better relationships with agents, to be honest. And that might be where the player relationship comes in. I think in England, it's just especially guarded, and clubs don't want the players really having much to do with the media at all. And so that's where this media training comes in, essentially training players not to give expansive answers. I think in Germany, there is still an openness. I mean, if you compare it, say, with the USA, I know it frightens Europeans when they come to the USA, maybe to play in an American league. It frightens them the extent to which journalists can just pour into a dressing room situation and ask questions. I mean, I must admit, even after all these years in the USA, that frightens me a little bit. It almost seems sort of an invasion of privacy. And I think there is a halfway house. For me, anyway, I like mixed zones. And I think in Germany, you still have that access with players. And you only need to read the myriad publications, you know, from Kicker to Sport Bild to local newspapers to see the access that publications do get, you know, because you can get mixed zone access to players and they will talk. They generally won't just walk on and ignore you. And so I think it's almost, in Germany, it's almost a bit of a halfway house between what it used to be in England and what it now has become.
Yeah. And I mean, as we know, as practitioners, so to speak, journalism is incredibly competitive, and sports journalism very much so, because it's something that a lot of us want to do since we're little. And so there's that real passion, and I think sometimes to unfold this drive to go beyond the ordinary. And so you just painted this picture about the mixed zones. I've been lucky to be in a few myself. And For those who haven't, it kind of looks a bit like the inside of a high school gymnasium.
That's right.
So a lot of like concrete, or like for Americans, maybe I would even say, at the bottom of the bleachers at like a high school kind of venue, you feel like you're in the belly of something. And there aren't really windows. And there's literally, it's kind of like a crime zone. There's like a kind of a belt, a barrier, like at the airport even. And that's where, depending on the club, anywhere between like 5 and 120 journalists will kind of hop around. It's like people waiting for the metro, like, oh, where's the wagon gonna stop? And they'll try and like find their position and then catch a player. And one of my first sports editors in Germany, his name is Dirk Adam. On Twitter, he's under @Bananenflanke.
Great name. Great football term, of course, the Bananenflanke. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something like a kind of curveball, like
Manny Kaltz of Hamburg used to be the ultimate exponent of that art back in the late 70s, early 80s. The Kaltz Bananenflanke, the banana ball from the right. Yeah,
I didn't know that. Yeah, so Dirk Adam, the first time that he sent me there with our official Focus Online press credentials, he said, Marie, don't go for Joshua Kimmich, Robert Lewandowski after the game or whoever scored the goals. Try and catch an assistant coach. Try and catch a youth player. Try and catch someone. I was there for a game against Hoffenheim. Try and catch one of the Hoffenheim guys.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And I guess I'm wondering, can you speak a little bit, maybe anecdotally, maybe like 1 or 2 examples of where you've been in that position? And you're, all these guys that are on Twitter, and those guys like who maybe aren't on Twitter from being in the press box. And of course, you all could go to the press conference with the coach after and before and have the same quotes. And that's very worthy. And then it's kind of like who's the fastest. But how in that, let's face it, kind of artificial environment of a match day situation, how do you do reporting that is original and takes the reader or listener maybe somewhere else?
Well, I think as commentators, maybe it's slightly different because I'm generally not doing match reports the way a written journalist would do. I'm thinking about my commentary during the game. So you think to yourself, okay, how can I come up with information that is unique? And what I've always done is I've always cultivated relationships with people. And as I say, you get to know people. As a commentator, you're very lucky because certainly in the UK or in Scotland, let's say, where I was working quite a lot a few years ago, I knew pretty much everybody in the Scottish game. And luckily enough, they knew me because they heard my voice on the games. And so you quickly sort of become friends with people. But I learned early on, and it's similar to the advice that you got, I learned early on that, you could be friends with a particular coach or manager, have a good relationship. But the person who's more likely to give you usable information is perhaps the kit man or the goalkeeping coach or, the youth coach who's there. And it's not that they're going to tell you things that are off limits, but they might just be more open. For example, with Celtic, I became very friendly with a guy called Stevie Woods, the goalkeeping coach, and also the Scotland's national team goalkeeping coach. And we had a routine whereby, I would arrive in the tunnel area, I'd go and see Stevie, and he would tell me everything I needed to know, and I think he probably did it with the tacit permission of the manager, Neil Lennon, at the time, because, Neil's busy on match nights, so he knows that there's a trust there that Stevie's going to tell me things that I can use in commentary. Neil doesn't have to spend 10 minutes talking to me at a time when he's preparing for his team talk. But you would find out, who trained well this week, who didn't train so well, who was under the weather, who was in a sick bed for a couple of days, things like that. And then maybe some tactical information as well about the other team and things to watch for. And again, you're not going to go and blurt that out on Twitter. I think that people understand that. There are certain things that maybe you want to know as a commentator. And I've always had managers in the game working with me who have told me these things. And I remember when I was covering Scotland years ago, the then manager, Andy Roxburgh, would sit down with the broadcasters. And if it was a friendly, if it was a competitive game, he wouldn't do this. But for a friendly, he would say, okay, just things to watch for. Probably around the hour mark, I'll bring him on, and I'll bring him on. So just so you have that information, maybe you want to say it, around the 55th minute that there's a good chance, so he's actually making us look good.
Yeah.
But
Like you have like a crystal ball.
but I think at the same time, it's clever because he's also realizing that he's having his own ideas explained on air, and made sense of, rather than commentators going, well, what on earth is he doing? Why is this happening? So I think it just comes down to trust. And as a commentator, you do need these relationships. You need to have people you go to. And it's the same in Germany. I have people I know around clubs, and, I'm not looking to get information on a match day, as I say, to put on social media or to run with as a breaking story. At all. I'm just looking for information that will enhance the commentary. Now, somebody else who is in the business of breaking stories, maybe that's different, and they're trying to get the scoop. For example, at the weekend there, Erling Haaland didn't play for Borussia Dortmund in the game in Gladbach, and people wanted to know why he wasn't playing, and the people who specialize in breaking those stories would have been on that story before it was officially announced. But for commentators, we're not as much on that. Although I do like to try to break stories on Twitter, but what I usually do is I try to report what's happening in Germany, because obviously, like you being a German speaker, not a native German speaker like yourself, but somebody who loves speaking German and loves following the minute-by-minute news flow in Germany, I like to be able to share that with the English language audience, because I think there is a bit of a void there still. Definitely.
And there are definitely some great people on Twitter who have also, like Ronan Murphy, I think,
Yes, indeed.
I mean, this word doesn't do him justice at all, but he aggregates so much of the local reportage that people would never otherwise have access to. And for example, Bild still does so much in print and in local editions, and no one would even know about that kind of stuff. And it's so interesting and worthwhile. And there are so many more where that came from.
Indeed.
So we've had a few comments about Borussia Dortmund, and you just brought up Erling Haaland. So I think something that interests me, we talked about, okay, what happens when these young world stars to be leave the Bundesliga to go to the Premier League, to go to La Liga, to make it big, play under Pep Guardiola, Jurgen Klopp, Carlo Ancelotti, Jose Mourinho, whoever it may be, and play for television audiences in Singapore and Indonesia and Brazil and Chile. That's very different, and live in world cities. You imagine going for, I remember Baba Rahman, the wing back, he went from, was he at Fürth or Augsburg? I don't even remember. But he went from a really little, adorable old medieval town to South London or West London. And we talked about that. Sorry for the kind of rewind there. But what about, Matthew Hoppe, who grew up in California with, very close-knit family, and then went to an academy, La Masia affiliated academy in the desert of Arizona when LA Galaxy turned him down, and somehow ended up in Gelsenkirchen, a kind of industrial city, a little like Pittsburgh for Americans, but much smaller. What is that like? Or even Jude Bellingham, how do they do it so well?
I can only imagine. I mean, obviously they have a support system, so I think that's the one thing. It's not like, somebody who's just going there and having to adapt. I from personal experience, I went to Germany very young as an exchange student / language assistant in this tiny part of, tiny village really, on the border of West and East Germany as it was. And I didn't have a support system, but it wasn't for that long. These guys are going, at 18 or 17 or even 16, you probably think you're going for life, and 3 months will seem like 3 years, and 6 months will seem like 6 years. But you do have this club there to support you. So, you're getting language lessons, and you're by definition having friends because they're around you all the time. New friends, not your old friends, and certainly not family in most cases. So I think we do have to cut these guys a bit of slack early on. And people are always very impatient. Why is this young player not doing this? Why has he not made the breakthrough? What's going on there? It's not a conveyor belt. It's not that kind of situation, at least not for the players. It's still a human situation. And, you know that the German school can be really tough. I think it's softened a bit in the last few years as it's become more international. But I remember talking to Owen Hargreaves about this a few years ago. Owen, who I worked with a lot on the Bundesliga when I was at BT Sport in the UK. And, Owen was a young kid who'd grown up in Canada and Calgary and, British family, but, basically from that part of Canada, never really given much thought to where he would play football, thrown into Bayern at the age of 16. And I said to him, what was it like? He said, I did not know what had hit me. I really didn't know. He said, but you know what? Looking back, he said, it was the best school I could have had. He said, I had to essentially pick myself up out of the deep end. He said, I was thrown in at the deep end, and essentially they were judging whether I could sink or swim. And, with people like Hermann Gerland working with him at that age and seeing what he was made of. And so it was a character test for him, linguistically, culturally, football-wise, at maybe the hardest school that there is in the world. But he came through it, and he's grateful that he did. So I think for these young Americans who are going to Germany, I think they're very lucky, because I think that this sea change in attitude has helped them. 20 years ago, it was commonplace to think in the US that you didn't really want to send your football-loving kids to Europe. You wanted them to go to college, you wanted them to complete college, and then maybe at 22 they'd get into MLS. And in the last few years, we've just seen that anybody who's got any football ability is no longer going to go down that road. I mean, in a sense, it was nice before that people said, no, education comes first, and then, football can follow on from that. But of course, these young kids are getting their education in the academies. They're combining that with the football education. And, it was always going to be a case of not if, but when. And now it's becoming the norm. And I think most parents who have good footballers for kids are seeing that Germany is the best pathway. It might not be where they stay in the long term, but it's the best place to start.
Yeah, I do have to follow up on Owen Hargreaves there, because that is fascinating. And one thing that stuck out to me, even before I could answer this follow-up question, you already addressed it, because I was going to ask, who are those people who helped him at the beginning? And you mentioned Hermann Gerland. For anyone who maybe doesn't know him, he's this Bayern Munich legend, and he's been at different times under 19 coach, reserves coach, other youth sides. He is now, I believe, moving up to the under 21 team temporarily as a co-coach, assistant coach. And he has formed players like Philipp Lahm and Bastian Schweinsteiger, Thomas Müller. And when I say formed, you never really know what that means, but they all credit him about shaping their personality and giving them, a kick in the butt occasionally. So I guess I wanted to say, did he have any stories like that? And also, were there perhaps other people? And it could have been, I don't know, someone at the fan shop, were there other people, was he at a guest family? Were there other people that helped Owen Hargreaves settle in?
He didn't name specifically other people, but what I can say is that he took it to heart if you remember when Pep Guardiola was in charge, and he made a couple of changes to the old guard. And I remember one of them was the doctor, Müller Wohlfahrt, who's been there again for decades. And he's got these sort of slightly different ideas about certain medical procedures, but most players really swear by his methods. He's got this history of coming up with different treatments. I mean, I think he was the one who came up with the horse placenta treatment many years ago. If you Google that, you'll find it somewhere, which again was controversial at the time, but the players have always loved him, and he's getting up there in years now, but he's still as fit as a fiddle. And so when he was downgraded and a few other senior people or old-time people were downgraded, I know Owen wasn't happy about that. He thought that was not the right way to go. But no, he was just full of praise for the whole setup, for everybody at the club that he worked with, from the top person down, from Uli Hoeneß to Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, Hermann Gerland, obviously, who'd come from Bochum, where he was a legend, where he is a legend, in Bochum. If you go to Bochum and talk about Hermann Gerland, then people smile, because that was his club before he went to Bayern. And as you said, now he's working for the DFB. So, I think I told Owen, I said, you should really write a book about your whole Bayern time, because I think in English language, again, apart from those of us who were following the Bundesliga closely and by extension following Owen closely, it's still a sort of a foggy chapter for a lot of people in England, because it wasn't really until he arrived in the Premier League that people started to get to know Owen a bit better. But he's a lovely guy, and I learned a lot from all the conversations I had with him about Bayern.
Yeah, I mean, if he needs a ghostwriter or a co-author
or
a strategist to write an autobiography,
I'll put you onto him. Yeah.
Yes, because it is fascinating. He's one of those early players. I started listening to the Bundesliga conference on the radio in Germany, and I don't know if this is unique to Germany because I didn't grow up in a different country until I was 10, but in Germany at 15:30, so 4:30 p.m. kickoff, which used to be most of the matches any Bundesliga weekend.
Yeah,
I think it used to be 6 parallel kickoffs, and these radio commentators sitting at Freiburg's Schwarzwaldstadion in the Black Forest, at Borussia Dortmund, facing the yellow wall, they would go back and forth and be like, oh, I see Owen Hargreaves, he just conquered the ball in midfield. He's seeking out Rocky Santa Cruz. Intercepted by, DD or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was incredible. It was like better than television. And it was so cinematic. And we would be on the German motorway going to some boring, parents' party or whatever. And we would just be absolutely like smitten by that. And he was a part of that. He was one of those first characters, like many, perhaps in comparison, people my age, if you grew up on the Premier League, that may have been Van Nistelrooy, and a little earlier maybe Alan Shearer, and it's just Thierry Henry, of course, and Dennis Bergkamp.
Yeah.
If for La Liga it might have been Luis Figo and Roberto Carlos. And Serie A was so glamorous back then with
it was.
And Del Piero. So I'm kind of blabbering on here, but it's so interesting that all these people are around. They're still around the game. They're still connected to their former clubs. Many of them feel very attached. I know sometimes when Patrick Ovomoyela is co-commentator, he'll be like, "Oh, Dortmund, come on!"
I also, when I work with Ovo, and for people who don't know, Patrick Ovomoyela loves Dortmund. He played for other clubs as well, for Werder Bremen, for Bielefeld, but Dortmund very close to his heart. And we did a game just the other week there, and Dortmund game, and I always have to remind him now, Ovo, today you're broadcasting to the world, not for Dortmund TV, just remember. And he goes, I know. But he's a great guy. And I think you make a good point about generation to generation. It's the one thing, maybe younger fans don't quite appreciate that yet, but I can tell you that at my age, I do, and you will someday as well. This linkage with football, with one team to another. For example, I was broadcasting, you mentioned it, Barcelona today. Now, that used to be my bread and butter 20 years ago, La Liga. I used to broadcast it every week for ESPN around the world. And I was like you, listening to the Bundesliga conference on the shortwave prior to doing my La Liga games. But the linkage goes, along the lines of, I remember the 2002-2003 season when Barcelona were struggling as they are now. And, Louis van Gaal was the coach. It ended in tears there. Radiantic came in. It was a wretched season. And I remember at that time people thinking, Barcelona might never be the same again. Just as this season, people are saying Barcelona might never be the same again. And it's a reminder that you got to play the long game, and things come in cycles, and Barca won't be down forever. I know that it's a terrible financial crisis, and they may not get out of it easily, but they've got these young players coming through, and we saw one of them today, Ansu Fati, and a couple of others as well, Gavi. And as I said, it's a reminder that the game survives and these clubs survive. And one of the great things is to study football history. And so one thing I say to people, and especially to young commentators, they say, what should I do? And I always say, read up on the history before the time that you were interested in the game. Because I used to do that because we didn't have the internet, the 1970s. We didn't have any of these tools. I used to just devour these books about, the history of football from the days of Stanley Matthews to the days of Pele. I remember Pele from the end of his career, but he was kind of a diminished force by then. But I used to read everything about his younger days. And I think that we can all learn. We're always learning. And there's nothing better than just refreshing our memories as to how good some of these players were. And the game isn't any more magical now than it was 50, 60 years ago. It was just as magical then. Trust me, 1974 World Cup, I can remember it like it was yesterday. It was the first World Cup that I ever watched, and it's still very vivid in my mind. And West Germany winning that World Cup against the Netherlands, I can still see Gerd Müller swiveling around and scoring that Müller-esque goal. And that magic will never disappear as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, the history, it's what makes the football world go round.
Yeah. And again, like sometimes anecdotes and stories that players, I mean, who can blame them, would never be like, oh, hi, Mixo, and I'm going to share how I prepared for this game. But then, like you hear about the banter in the dressing room, in the books, and it teaches you something about the culture as well. So when you were talking about reading up, two writers came to mind for me, because, one of them is Raphael Honigstein.
Oh, brilliant. Great guy too.
He's got that absolute like dream job of kind of explaining German soccer, Fußball, to the English-speaking world and explaining the Premier League to Germans. And
he does it very well.
He does it in print. He does it on TV.
I'm always amazed actually how well he can do that, because I find that the more that I'm in a Bundesliga world, which I sort of am and have been most of my life, but the more immersed I am in the Bundesliga, the harder I actually find it to focus on English football. Even when I was living in England, there was the funny thing. People said, "Oh, you're in England, tell me all about what's happening with Crystal Palace." And I would say, "Well, I can tell you more about what's happening with Köln at the moment than I can with Crystal Palace, because that's the world that I'm inhabiting." But Raphael is amazing at that, because he regularly is popping up on German TV talking about English football, and then does, as you said, the same thing in reverse for the UK audience with regard to the Bundesliga.
Yeah, and I mean, for anyone who might want to have an easy entryway into Raphael's writing, he wrote the kind of definitive biography about Jürgen Klopp. It's called Bring the Noise.
It's on my you can probably see it. It's on my shelf here somewhere. I'm trying to see. It is there somewhere. Where is it? It's there, trust me.
I love that. So I don't know him personally, but if you want to send this link to him after, I'm sure he would enjoy this. We can just tell him where to watch it. He doesn't have to watch the whole thing.
I'm gonna tell him.
Yeah, it's Bring the Noise is an incredible, and again, you learn so much. Like, I don't think many people know this, that Jürgen Klopp, yes, he's a Dortmund legend, but he's also a legend of this small carnival club, which sounds like, to Germans, it's an insult, but everyone else thinks it's adorable. Like, one of my first editors, another one, not Bananenflanke, but this lovely guy called Marco Plein, who's kind of helped get me up to speed on NBA, which is like my 2021 love. That was like a real
great.
He's really into basketball, and he's from Mainz. So he supports the New York Knicks and Mainz 05. So he's got a very tough life.
That's a great combination.
I once in a live ticker, so like in a play-by-play that I was writing for Focus Online, I referred to Mainz as, I changed the headline, like, der Karnevalsverein bringt Fans zum Lachen, Führung durch Onisivo, or something like that, And he was so offended. He took a screenshot, sent it to me on WhatsApp, and he was like, Karnevalsverein, what do you mean? And I was like, is that not like a legit thing we can call them? But to like really kind of bring it back to my story there, Honigstein, in his biography of Jürgen Klopp, goes into Jürgen Klopp's kind of upbringing in like a Protestant family with like a masculine, very charismatic father, and then his playing career. And he was, decent. He was a center back, but he didn't he wasn't exactly, you know, an Upamecano.
No.
He was more kind of like a bread and butter center back. And then he, you know, Honigstein, I'm not going to retell Jürgen Klopp's life because Honigstein does that much better, but he mentioned things like how Christian Heidel, who was a used car salesman,
he was,
through sheer like grit and talent, somehow took over Mainz, convinced Jürgen Klopp when he was like in his early 30s, okay, you're going to take over now. You're going to take over a team that might be relegated. He was still a player at the time.
Yeah.
And it's not only this conversation, because that conversation, you know, it could be in like a Marriott hotel or in an airport. No, this is Mainz. Like, and you know, he does such a good job, Honigstein, of like giving you a feeling for an atmosphere, like we were talking about earlier with Siebener Straße, of a grounds, of a club. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. And the other writer, and I'll make this very brief, Harry Harris, English sports journalist. I met him because his daughter Poppy met my baby sister Lottie, my youngest sister. I have 3 younger sisters. They were in nursery together at like this, I kid you not, like village school, you know, with like bonnets, blue bonnets, and they were best friends for a long time. And that's how I met Harry Harris. And he's been kind of like a mentor to me. And he's a great, great writer. He wrote an incredible biography of Pelé.
You know what? Just what you've said there is quite important, I think, for anybody trying to get into journalism. It really is all contacts and connections. And people sometimes think that connections would refer to, you know, privilege, you know, would refer to, well, you know, the families are connected and they're all wealthy. It doesn't have to be that way. You know, I don't come from a privileged background. I don't. I come from a very normal, run-of-the-mill Scottish background. But I think if you go about it the right way and you're inquisitive, I think you have to be inquisitive to be a journalist. You have to be curious about things, you know, otherwise it's not the career for you. But if you are inquisitive and you have a nice way about you and an open way about you and you try to meet people on that basis, then, you know, that's how you build connections. And some of the best football connections I have are from my earliest days. And, you know, just bumping into people randomly and finding that you have something in common. And, you know, it's the way the world works, isn't it? You help somebody, they help you, and, you know, you stay friends, hopefully. And so I think that's, you know, people think that journalism is very complicated, and it can be. It can be very intricate when you get to the higher levels of it. But a lot of it is simply knowing people and having that trust.
Wonderful advice. I can't add anything to that. Wow, I've lost my train of thought there for a little second.
Trust me, that happens to me almost every game I commentate on. I go, what was I? Okay, all right, okay, yeah, I've got it now.
In that case, okay, I'm just gonna bear with me for a second.
Sure.
This is another showmaster moment where I want to like try something new, and it's probably gonna be terrible, but there should be a question appearing at the bottom now, like kind of like a news ticker.
Let's see.
And
what comes up.
Let's hear it.
I love that question. If a mate was visiting Germany, which football grounds would you take them to? You know, it's funny. I get this question a lot on social media. And I always say my answer could be different according to which day the question is posed. You know, so if you ask me on a Monday, I might give you 5 venues. Ask me on a Tuesday, I might give you 5 different ones. What I usually say is I'll sort of preface it by saying that when I was at NBC doing bits and pieces for their Premier League coverage a couple of years ago, I would work with some really talented young producers who, believe it or not, because they were quite new to the sport, had got jobs at NBC and really quickly become immersed in it, still hadn't been to Europe, hadn't been to England to see a game. And they would always ask me, so what's the first stadium I should go to in England? And my answer would always be a stadium in Germany. And I said, nothing against England. Of course, there are many great venues in England. But for me, you really want to go to Germany to get the full-blooded, full-throated football atmosphere in normal times. And again, we're not quite in normal times at the moment. But the ones I would give you would be, I mean, as I say, I could give you 5, I could give you 10. Most people would say Dortmund because they're the club that people know now. They're familiar with, you know, Die Gelbe Wand, the yellow wall, the Südtribüne, and what that is all about. But I think there are others that match Dortmund, to be example. One that I think is highly underrated is Frankfurt. And I've always felt that. I've always felt when I go to Frankfurt, there is something special about the atmosphere there. And so I'd have that on my list. As a sort of an adopted Kölner, I would have to say Köln for the special atmosphere. I just think Köln is incredible for community. There's a coming together there that you don't see in many other places. Because let's face it, the team has been, from okay to sometimes terrible over the last 20, 25 years, having when I was growing up, been one of the best teams in Germany. But when you consider that the form has been fair to middling, the fans absolutely get behind that club, and so that is special. I would have to mention St. Pauli because I think it's unique. I think it's different. It's maybe not for everybody, but it's a big show in Pauli and the Milan Tour, and I think that's something that you do have to experience just to feel it, just to be able to savor that. And then you could, I'm missing clubs out because, as I said, you could ask me tomorrow, and I might give you, 5 others that, quite simply are incredible. And Darmstadt is one that I love because it's a bit of a throwback. It's a smaller stadium, but it's mostly terracing. Mm-hmm. And it tends to be full. It's like going back to the 1980s. It's what I remember when I first went to Bundesliga stadia back in the 1980s as a young fan. So, Bochum, there's another one. That is special because it's, first of all, the Ruhrpott, the industrial heart. It's right, next to Gelsenkirchen, which is also special, so I feel like I'm missing them all out here. But, Bochum, and of course I have to mention Schalke being on with you. But
the more stadiums you're going to mention, the more others will feel offended for not having been mentioned.
I'm getting myself into hot water. But Bochum, of course, has not only the best Currywurst in Germany when it comes to football venues, it also has this amazing ritual before the game, where you have the Grönemeyer anthem, which is called Bochum. Herbert Grönemeyer, huge musical artist, from the 80s on when I first started going to Germany. And he had this hit song called Bochum, and it, all starts with the words, tief im Westen, deep in the West, and basically talks about where the sun is, wo die Sonne verstaubt, where the sun is dusty, and it's just so evocative, and you cannot help losing yourself in that when you go there. And Grönemeyer every so often comes to the stadium himself and sings that anthem. Imagine being there when that happens. So I'm really thrilled they're back in the Bundesliga this season. So I've given you a few there. I see somebody saying the Bayer Arena. I love the Bayer Arena. I wouldn't put it up there as the most atmospheric. I think it's a great place to go, but it's more of a family crowd, I think, in Leverkusen. But I like going there, and I love the little walk that you can make when you get off at Leverkusen Mitte. You sort of walk through past a few houses, along a stream, and then in front of you, all these pictures, the training pictures of Bayer 04, and there is the Bayer Arena. So, yeah, honestly, we could do a whole podcast just on every German stadium, Marie.
I know. I'm going to leave this gem that we just got for the end as the last question.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to hold you longer than an hour. I'm sorry. I feel like I've
No, it's fine.
You it's roped you around your chair.
Not a problem.
I was going to ask to stay on the topic of Bochum. I once wrote a piece about how Hermann Gerland was such a mentor for Leon Goretzka.
Yeah.
And he basically saw him at an under-19, I think, Westpokal final, where Bochum thrashed Schalke 4-1 or 4-0, something like that. And Goretzka did everything, set up goals, scored goals, dribbled, won a penalty, anything. And must have stuck out because he's quite tall. He's quite tall for a central midfielder, and he must have stuck out in, the lanky, skinny, still developing 17, 18-year-old crowd. And he pretty much picked up the phone, or I don't even remember if he picked up the phone or if he drove down, maybe both. But he was hello, Bayern Munich, he has to come here,
Yeah.
And of course, that didn't end up happening for a few years, as we know, partly because Goretzka was so attached to Bochum and wanted to finish his schooling there and stay with his family. He went to neighboring Schalke, but Gerland has also since seen Kutucu play for Schalke, and he again apparently took a fancy to him and was like, oh, maybe this is someone for Bayern. Funnily enough, Kutucu then scored against Bayern. I think that was his first Bundesliga goal, but now he's in Turkey. And again, like I feel like I'm terrible at setting up questions.
No, I'm enjoying listening to the preamble. It's good fun.
When you do have those sheets of papers, you prepare for a game, you prepare for Barcelona, maybe let's stay with the Bundesliga. You prepare for Greuther Fürth against Bayern Munich, and you have those columns of the players. Amazing. Okay, a little closer, more closer. I'm literally like, my eyes are coming to Okay, now I can see some numbers on the side at least.
That's Greuther Fürth Bayern from Friday night. There you go.
Oh, wonderful! You have to, if you're willing, you'd have to take a photo of that, and then we can post it with the episode after. How do you do that? Where do you get that information? When do you start? Talk us through that process.
It really depends on the assignment. If I know several weeks ahead of time that I'm doing a particular game, I just start scribbling. Sometimes I know a few weeks ahead. Sometimes I only know a few days ahead. So it's just the process, the creative process for me. And it might sound like a contradiction because, sometimes the creative process is actually just scribbling things that I've written out before. But it's part of the memorizing process, So I view it as an exam paper every time I'm doing a game. So if you think about an exam paper, whether in college or high school, you want to be ready for that day. So you have all the facts at your fingertips. And so that's just what I've always done. And a lot of it is laborious. A lot of it is just, repeating information. For example, if I look at what I had written down here for, let's just have a look at a random Bayern player, Leon Goretzka, 200 Bundesliga appearance. I've got that bolded because I wanted to make sure I had that line, especially if he scored. So I wanted to make sure that was implanted in the brain. And I also had the line, you mentioned him there, his love of Bochum. The line that, the famous quote now, he said, you cry twice when you go to Bochum, when you arrive and when you leave. And I wanted to be able to work that in somewhere. So it's little things to jog the memory, really. And so it's all stuff that I find myself. A lot of it is just going through the newspapers, to be honest. That's my daily routine. I go through the papers, I just search and search and search. And, I write and write and write. And what I always say is that, I produce these sheets, but they're not for show. They're really just so that I'm ready for the game. And I'm probably lucky if I use 5% of what I've written down. That's the reality of it. But the way I see it is that there'll be another day, so that if I keep recording this information, come the next day, a bit of information that I didn't get to use maybe will be relevant. And that's the key. It has to be relevant information. I'm not just going to throw info out there for the sake of it. There has to be some kind of context to it for me to get it in. But like I always say, to use the 5%, you need to prepare the 100%. So there's 95% getting left on the page. But it's all part of the process. And you have to love that if you want to be a commentator, because if you don't enjoy the shoveling, then you're not going to enjoy this job too much.
Yeah, and for those, this will be my last question, and then we just have the Berlin Derby, and then I'm going to give you back your freedom.
No problem.
For those listeners, and maybe those who just thought of it right now, like I'm feeling kind of like keen now. For those people who can imagine commentating and or maybe have dreamt of that their whole life, how? Beyond the networking and like who do you hire before that? Like, how do you practice? Do you record tapes? Like what? How does that happen?
I think if you talk to anybody in my line of work, they will tell you that they've wanted to do this from a very young age, and they probably were doing it from a young age in their own way. Now, I can only say that what I did was I used to have a small tape recorder in the days when we didn't have iPhones or anything like that. We just had, tape devices with actual tape. And I used to carry it around, and I would talk into it and commentate on games in the playground at school, games in the park, and people thought I was mad. I would then go to the local stadium in Aberdeen to reserve games, and I would talk into the machine there, and people thought I was mad. And but I didn't care, because I really enjoyed it and I wanted to do it. I wanted to give myself the best chance of doing it. So then I went to hospital radio, which is a volunteer set up in the UK. Every hospital has its own, or used to have its own, radio station to provide a service for the patients in hospital. So I used to broadcast the local football matches on there. So it's a way of saying that if you really want to get into it, then you have to be a self-starter. And, people often email me and say, how do I do it? And I say, well, it's really up to you. And nobody's going to give it to you. Nobody's going to say, oh, here's a course where you get all this practical experience, and then in a year's time, you will be a broadcaster. No, it doesn't work out that way. But you can make it happen for yourself if you're really dedicated. And so that means, nowadays on your iPhone, just go and record stuff and listen to the commentators who you respect, and ask yourself, what is it that they're doing that makes them so polished, and analyze it as you would analyze, why is a footballer so good? Why is a golfer so good? What is it about a commentator that you admire that makes him or her so good? And make some notes, and then, don't so much copy them, but try to come up with your own style, and using the right technique, and learning from people who you respect. And I think you have to realize that if you want to be a commentator, it's not going to happen overnight. You're going to make mistakes, and that is natural and part of the creative process. And you've got to give yourself time and scope to make those mistakes. And don't be in too much of a rush, but give it your all. Because it can be done. It's not easy. There are not a lot of full-time jobs as a commentator, but if you really want it, you can do it. And the other thing I should say is you have to really think about the voice. And by that, I mean, and I will say this to young broadcasters, when your friends are out having a party on a Friday night and enjoying themselves, you are, as a commentator, going to be sitting at home, reading your notes and resting your voice. Because that's the one thing. You can't go into a game on a Saturday having had a rough night out with your mates, and then the voice is not cooperating, because the voice has to be ready to hit those high notes, and to go up and down, and to almost work like a singer. I always say it's a bit like being a singer. It's the same kind of discipline. And I'm really fascinated talking to professional singers, because I've realized that they go through the same things that we go through as commentators. It's all about the voice. It's all about peak performance, and it's all about preparation. So if you really want to do it, go for it, and take those things on board.
So if you have the skills of a private detective and the voice and discipline of an opera singer, this might be for you.
It could be for you, yes.
I had to wrap my head around this comment that I just blended in. I think it's a reference to me kidnapping you on a Sunday night and making you talk for an hour when I said it would be 15 minutes. But yeah, I promised that there's just one more question, and this is one of our listeners. So I just have to find this one. And if I don't, I will just mention it again. Maybe it goes away because I already oh no, here we go. Yeah. Tell us about this. Why is he asking this? Why is this special? Have you been?
I've not been to the Union Hertha derby, but I was in Köpenick on the night when Union won promotion to the Bundesliga, and I was commentating for the World Feed with Stefan Freund, and that was actually a real treat, because for those of you who don't know, Stefan, not only a great player back in the day, but also an East German. Stefan is from the former DDR. And so that gave me an incredible insight into the whole thing. I used to, I'm probably not supposed to admit this, but I used to listen to East German radio as well as West German radio back in the 1980s, because I was a keen German student. I was also a politics student. So I was really fascinated with the whole Eastern Bloc. And I used to hear the Oberliga being broadcast. And so for Union, this team, they weren't even a big team in the days of East Germany, to suddenly have a chance of being promoted and then winning promotion, that was just incredible. And they overcame Stuttgart. I did both games, went to Stuttgart for the first match and then traveled to Berlin for the second. And that will stay with me for a long time. You know, everything from Nina Hagen, you know, the Union anthem to just the post-match celebrations, which, oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. There's your best friend now. And your best friend has been missing you. I can see that.
I'm so sorry. I had to give people a really apartment tour that was not called for. My dog was barking in the other room. I hope it wasn't too annoying on the audio, but
no.
I had to rescue him. He's only 6 months, so
I know. I've
like
seen him
you were saying, like for young players, you know, 6 months feels like 6 years.
Yeah.
For him, 60 minutes feels like 60 days. Like,
oh, I know. Oh, such a shame. But yeah, so Union, you know, special story, and a lot of people have latched onto that story. I like Hertha because I have a bit of a soft spot for them, because I remember, in fact, I'll tell you a story before we finish about Hertha and Union. I, in 1985, was in Kassel, which was the nearest town to where I was studying. And Hessen-Kassel became the team that I watched. And I still have a thing for them, even though they're down the divisions now, trying to come back up. But they were playing Hertha. And I remember at the time, I remember in the crowd seeing this banner that said, in the Hertha section, that said, Erste FC Union. And I remember thinking, that's the team in East Germany that, you know, I heard their games on East German radio. So I remember at the Bahnhof, at the railway station after the game, the Hertha fans were there. And I asked one or two of them, I said, Union. I said, well, you know, what's the connection? They said, that is our brother club in the East. And in those days, there used to be this sort of relationship whereby there was an understanding that Union and Hertha were almost brothers. And Hertha played in Europe behind the Iron Curtain, and Union fans would go and support them because they were allowed to do that in other Eastern Bloc countries.
Yeah.
And so this was a friendship going all the way, you know, when the wall came down, they were great friends. There was a special benefit match not long after that. And it was this celebration of the two brother clubs. But then it kind of went the other way. When they ended up in the Zweite Bundesliga together, suddenly the new generation of fans had forgotten all that, and an edge came into it. And that edge has only become something, you know, that we would talk about more when it comes to these two clubs. So it's a story that's gone from kind of friendship to, you know, locking horns in a way that, you know, is not as quite as friendly, let's just say.
What a fascinating note to end on. What a great example of the fan culture, both in terms of those unlikely fan friendships. You know, we talked about Bochum and Bayern, not that particular friendship, but I remember, was it you? Did you mention that on the broadcast?
I did, yeah, just the other week there, the Bayern Bochum game. And that, of course, is, as you've said, that they are good friends. And it goes back to an incident in the 1970s, the two fan groups, when Bayern fans came under attack in Bochum. But then a group of Bochum fans, the Bochumer Jungen, decided we're not having this. And they essentially rescued the Bayern fans, took them into their local Gaststätte, and they all drank beer together for the rest of the night. And then it became a thing for a couple of decades that Bochum and Bayern fans would be friends. It fell away for a bit, but now it's come back. And I think these things are nice. I think they're really what football is all about. I mean, we love our clubs and we love the game, but I'm always very uneasy about hatred. You know, hatred of it. I don't hate anybody, and I think the idea of hating a football club to me is you know, it's pretty ridiculous, really. I mean, you can dislike, you can want your own team to do well, but you know, the bottom line is, as football fans, no matter who we support, we have one thing in common, and that is the game. You know, and we all love it. So yeah,
right. Definitely. Is there anything you want to plug? Where can people listen to you, read you, I always ask this at the end because I've been a beneficiary of being asked that myself.
Oh, well, that's very kind. Well, I enjoy writing a column for ESPN every week on German football. I should have another one coming up this midweek, so you can find that also on my Twitter feed, which is at Raycom, RAECOMM. And if you are interested, especially in German football, and you don't follow me, then maybe you'll consider doing it. And I do try to share what I consider to be the magic of German football with the English-speaking audience. But I'm back on air this week. I've got a couple of games for ESPN, but not Bundesliga games for once. I've got 2 Spanish games this week. I've got Athletic Bilbao, Alaves, and then a really big one next Saturday, which is Atletico against Barcelona. Ooh. On Saturday. That is a beauty.
Yes.
So, yeah, looking forward to broadcasting that one next weekend.
Wonderful. And that will be a reunion of Griezmann and Barcelona, right?
It will, yeah. Now that he's with Atletico again, yeah. It's going to have a lot of different angles to it, that one, and
a lot of spice, hopefully. Yeah. Wonderful. Dankeschön.
Bitteschön und danke für die Einladung.
Sehr gerne und schönen Abend. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Bonne soirée. And now I'm out of things to say, but yeah, thanks so much, Derek. I appreciate your time and hope to speak to you soon.
Let's do it again sometime. Thanks, Marie.
Bye.